Thank you for joining me. I'd like to share a little bit of information about New York's rich legacy of American Revolutionary War sites, but specifically ones that are underwater and have to do with nautical archaeology. In just 1 week from tomorrow, April 19th, we will mark the 250th anniversary of the Shot Heard Round the World, the opening engagements of the American Revolution, the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. New York certainly saw a fair share of action in the following years, and today I'll touch upon just a few of the maritime encounters that pitted the Americans, sometimes with help from friends, against the all-powerful British Navy. I'm an underwater archaeologist by training, with work on both submerged indigenous sites that have been drowned or were drowned thousands of years ago by global sea level rise, and also I have experience on much more recent shipwreck sites. And one of the benefits of working on archaeology from the last few centuries is often we have access to a rich collection of first-hand accounts, things like maps, letters, diaries, that can really fill in the gaps of our knowledge. But of course, sometimes we're lucky enough to find objects that have survived in the archaeological record. So let's dive in, pun intended, to look at some of New York's maritime sites associated with the American Revolution. So let's start with the place where I come from, Fish-Shaped Paumanok, Long Island. That's the place that shaped my interest in maritime and underwater archaeology. New York, and specifically Long Island and the area around what is now New York City, was ideally located to control both the northern and southern colonies. So the waters around Long Island, and especially New York Harbor, were among the first targets the British sought to control. In addition, the harbor was a year-round port, which was already a major hub of coastwise and transatlantic trade. The Battle of Long Island, Brooklyn today, took place in August of 1776, and that resulted from the struggle for control over New York and its harbor. Soon after that day, in August of 1776, the British did indeed occupy New York City. Early in the war, British soldiers were ordered to destroy every ship and boat, wharf, naval store, and warehouse on Long Island to prevent the Patriots from raising a navy. The British efforts were not entirely successful, and patriots who remained on Long Island under British military rule did not sit quietly. Guerrilla warfare was conducted on the waters of Long Island, and the vessel most often used was a small open boat called a whaleboat. During the war, these small craft were used for espionage, smuggling, and even kidnapping, although their prime activity was raiding. Propelled by sail or rowed, whaleboats were fast, silent, and could be hauled over land and easily hidden. The advantages of the whaleboat ensured that it would be in use for decades after the Revolution and even after the demise of the whaling industry on Long Island. The direct descendant of the 18th century whaleboat was the lifeboat used well into the 20th century. One successful whaleboat raid took place in November 1780, when New York City and Long Island were occupied by the British. In this event, Major Benjamin Talmadge put 80 men of the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons in 8 whaleboats. They crossed Long Island Sound from Connecticut, landing at Old Man's Harbor, now Mount Sinai Harbor, on the north shore of Long Island. Their objective? To attack Fort St. George at Mastic on the south shore, occupied by Loyalists and used as a provisioning depot for the British in Suffolk County. Bad weather forced Talmadge to remain hidden for a day, but they surprised and easily captured Fort St. George at dawn on November 23rd. The fort was taken, and on their return to their hidden whaleboats on the North Shore, the Patriots destroyed 300 tons of hay that had been collected for the British Army. This sounds like a small thing, but it was a major event. Talmadge reached Connecticut with 54 prisoners, and while only one of Talmadge's men was wounded, the raid killed or wounded 7 Loyalists. Perhaps the best-known naval event of the war on Long Island waters is the loss of the HMS Culloden. This British 74-gun ship of the line was stationed with a small squadron in Gardner's Bay between the forks of eastern Long Island. And just as sort of a side note, the 74-gun ship of the line comes from a military naval tactic of lining up against your enemy and just trying to pound them into oblivion. But the 74-gun ship in particular was one of the keys to the British Navy's success. It was small enough and light enough that it could still be maneuvered easily, but heavy enough that it could carry a really broad assortment of different cannon, those 74 guns. So nice balance between maneuverability and firepower. In January 1781, the British learned that 3 French vessels were preparing to leave Newport, Rhode Island, and headed to engage the British in Virginia. 3 British ships, Culloden, Bedford, and America, were dispatched to give chase and attempt to capture the French ships. Soon after leaving Gardiner's Bay, the British ships were engulfed in a bitter snowstorm. Remember, this is January. The report of the French maneuvers may actually have been a ruse to lure the British ships out into the stormy Atlantic Ocean. Rather than heading south, as the intelligence reports had indicated, the French vessels reversed course and returned to Newport unscathed. The America was swept out to sea and eventually made landfall near the Northern Carolina Capes. The Bedford was driven close to shore at the eastern tip of the South Fork of Long Island, but anchored before crashing into the rocky shore. The Culloden did not fare so well. In the midst of the storm, the captain, Captain Balfour, mistakenly believed the ship had cleared Montauk Point, the very farthest eastern tip of Long Island, when the alarm of land and breakers upon the lee bow was given. The anchors were dropped immediately, but to no avail. The Culloden struck ground at North Neck, today known as Culloden Point. Attempts to free the Culloden following the storm were unsuccessful, as the ship was pinned by a large rock and water slowly filled the hold. The crew was ordered to remove the Culloden stores and provisions, along with anything they could take, smaller cannons, spars, rigging, anything that was portable, essentially. The remaining carcass of the hull was burned to the waterline to prevent salvage by the Patriots. This operation lasted nearly a month, during which time at least 8 men from the Culloden deserted the Royal Navy. We think they probably sought refuge with local families in East Hampton. While the British were busy recouping, the French seized the opportunity to sail past Long Island without interference and headed for Virginia in February. The British left their station in pursuit the following month, having failed in their duty to keep the French confined to Rhode Island. And this is actually a turning point in the war, because the French Navy supporting the Americans in Virginia helped to lead to victory. There were other Revolutionary War era shipwrecks in Long Island waters that we know about through accounts. One particularly fantastic one that people have been looking for literally centuries is the British frigate HMS Hussar. The vessel was reputed to have been carrying gold to pay the troops. We think it was lost around Hellgate, where the East River empties into Long Island Sound. But to date, all the missions trying to find that gold have been unsuccessful. So far, in terms of Long Island waters, only the resting place of the Culloden is known to date. The site area is really well known to scuba divers. It's marked by large timbers and a few encrusted cannon that periodically disappear beneath shifting sands. The Culloden site itself is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and artifacts from the shipwreck site are in the collection of the Town of East Hampton Marine Museum. Being on the National Register, and in fact just being a historic shipwreck, lends the site some protections. The site of the Culloden is one of the very few of the hundreds of shipwrecks around Long Island to have received any archaeological attention, although a comprehensive survey of the site has yet to be completed. So if you're a scuba diver and you find yourself at the east end of Long Island, the Culloden wreck site is a really nice dive. If you're used to diving in faraway warm water places, it might not seem this way, but the visibility tends to be pretty good for the Long Island nearshore environment. We're talking typically 15 to 20 feet or so. That's good. And the site itself is only around 20 feet deep during most parts of the tide cycle. The sandy bottom sometimes obscures the site, but if you're there at the right time, you can definitely check out several of the massive timbers that are still on the bottom. Other waterways of New York have seen underwater archaeological surveys, resulting in the discovery of Revolutionary era shipwrecks, including places in Lake George and Lake Champlain. I participated in several rounds of survey work on the Hudson River, and that's a place that is definitely not conducive to a leisurely dive. The water in the Hudson's very murky, cold, has uninviting currents, not to mention the ship traffic, but the potential for bringing shipwrecks and other sites to light will hopefully make the challenges ahead worthwhile. So far, underwater archaeology work in the Hudson River has mainly relied on remote sensing. So instead of sending divers to the bottom to observe firsthand, we're using technology to image the river bottom. Initial surveys have mapped roughly 300 anomalies that may represent historic shipwrecks, and we know that there are sites from the American Revolution in the Hudson River, one found, and many more awaiting confirmed discovery. So to give you a little historic background, the Hudson River was a contested landscape from the opening battles of the American Revolution. George Washington himself described the strategic importance of the river in late 1775. Little bit of a quote here where he's talking about that it's so important I don't really have to enlarge upon them, but the rest of the quote that's not on the slide is him going on to enlarge upon them with many, many words. In an effort to control the Hudson River, the Continental Congress ordered the construction of 2 forts in the Hudson Highlands region, which was a natural choke point, and that was in 1775. That same year, the Continental Navy was born when a naval committee was authorized to purchase merchant ships and convert them into an emergency fleet. It was soon apparent that new warships would be required to face the British fleet, so the Congress ordered 13 frigates to be built. 2 of the new warships were built in Poughkeepsie, right on the Hudson River. Those were the 28-gun Congress and the 24-gun Montgomery. They were both launched in October of 1776 before they were fully completed. Trying times. Meanwhile, the fortification of the river continued in anticipation of the arrival of British warships, culminating in the outfitting of 8 posts along the navigable portion of the Hudson River, including 5 areas in the Hudson Highlands. Part of the Americans' plans for defending the river consisted of creating obstructions where British ships would be caught or at least slowed at key locations where they'd be vulnerable to cannon fire from nearby forts. These defensive structures included scuttled ships, some rigged with iron pikes projecting just below the water surface to snag passing vessels, as well as features that extended shore to shore, including 2 massive iron chains. Here are segments from the West Point chain, and something called a chevaux de frise, a series of sunken caissons with projecting iron pikes. These were placed north of West Point. When I think about what was happening during this period, I have to smile at the ingenuity and creativity that the folks on the ground employed in, facing off against the British Navy. One of the most important naval innovations of the late 18th century was an invention of a torpedo-carrying submarine. This is called the Turtle, sometimes called the American Turtle. It's the first submarine ever to have been used in combat. It was launched in New York Harbor in September 1776. The mission of this one-man craft was to destroy the 64-gun HMS Eagle by planting an explosive device on the hull of the British ship. The pilot wasn't able to place the bomb on the Eagle, but instead released it into the water, and that did result in a large explosion. So although the Turtle failed to destroy its target, the experiment was a success in that the British responded to this new threat by moving the fleet farther out to sea. Despite the American efforts to defend the important waterway, the Hudson River fell largely to the British early in the war. After the port city of New York fell in August 1776, the British ships Phoenix and Rose moved into the lower Hudson Valley. A futile attempt by the seriously outgunned Americans to engage the British ships near Yonkers resulted in the loss of 2 American sloops, one of which may have been carrying the Turtle, and a British sailing tender. Forts Montgomery and Clinton were attacked by British forces of more than 3,000 men and 6 ships in October 1777. The Continental Defense consisted of only 900 men and 5 vessels, the frigates Montgomery and Congress, those vessels that had been built in Poughkeepsie, 2 rowed galleys, and a privateer sloop. In only 2 days, the British gained control of both forts after attacking by land rather than by the anticipated water route. The two Continental frigates and the galley Shark were burned to prevent their capture by the British. Following the battle, the British fleet sailed north to Kingston to burn the city, and the fleet prison operated by the New York Council of Safety. So just to give you an overview of Revolutionary era resources that we know were lost in the Hudson River, a couple of slides. So here's the known American losses, and then the known British losses, along with some of those obstructions that had been placed in the river. While the American attempts to maintain control of the Hudson River were ultimately unsuccessful, many of the innovations first employed here were later refined. Lessons learned by a fledgling American Navy on the Hudson River would factor into the rise of American sea power during the 19th century. The discovery and investigation of American Revolutionary sites in the Hudson River does have the potential to enhance our understanding of not just local and New York State, but also United States history, and also to advance the field of nautical archaeology. An underwater archaeology survey attempted to locate known American Revolution vessels and defensive structures in the river between Fort Montgomery and West Point in the Hudson Highlands. The project entailed new high-resolution side-scan sonar mapping of the entire river bottom in the study area, along with something called multi-beam sonar work at dozens of selected sites, along with some metal detecting or magnetometer survey. So again, these are all remote sensing technologies where we don't have to put divers in the water. Instead, we're using technology in different ways to image what is lying on the river bottom. Most of this work was conducted aboard the NOAA hydrographic survey vessel Rudy, with additional ultra-high resolution multi-beam data collection using other smaller vessels. So let me tell you a little bit about sonar systems because I'm just sort of rattling them off. But our team has been very lucky. We had access to a number of different sonar systems. So basically what this is deploying sound in the form of sound waves underwater, and the intensity and rate at which the sound is returned to the torpedo or the device, the antenna, is transferred or translated into a digital image that we can see in real time on shipboard. For decades, literally decades, underwater archaeologists have had access to something called side-scan sonar, which uses the strength of return sound waves, we call this backscatter, to generate a two-dimensional digital image of the seafloor, or in our case, the riverbed. So that's great. It gives you some idea what's down there. But multi-beam sonar maps both the water depth and backscatter along a swath of seabed, giving a three-dimensional image. So this is what it looks like when you're on shipboard, actually collecting the data. With this particular unit, instead of a side scan sonar that's sending out one ping of sound to each side, this is sending out a fan of 240 pings at one time. So not only are we getting the intensity of the return signal that tells us something about is it bouncing off something hard, like a ship timber, or is it bouncing off something soft, like a mud? But it's also giving us a three-dimensional image. And this sort of gives you a nice overview of where we were in the river, with that rainbow highlighting the three-dimensional multi-beam information compared to traditional black and white two-dimensional side-scan sonar data. As part of our research, we were able to compare different high-resolution multi-beam sonar systems and refine our methods to best capture images of shipwrecks on the riverbed. So just an example of one of the early systems, we had access to the EM 3000 compared to the Reason, the 8125 multi-beam system. You can see just the units, the rate of collection, data collection, and then refinements in terms of the editing that we can do on shipboard, how much more information you can get on the same site with this multi-beam scanning. And a complete multi-beam system includes, in addition to the transducer that sends out those sound waves, we have a motion sensor, DGPS navigation, and all the appropriate software for data acquisition, editing, and processing. So we basically go out during the day doing lines. It's sort of like mowing the lawn. I'll show you an example of that in just the next slide. But There's a lot of editing that goes on, but kind of the nice part about living on a boat is you can have folks doing the data collection and other folks doing the editing round the clock. And those lines in the river, it's basically just like mowing a lawn, going back and forth, collecting the data so you cover an entire area. So partnering with NOAA, we were able to secure 5 days of ship time on the Rudy. And in those 5 days, we used that time to map the riverbed in parts of the lower Hudson and also this 12-mile portion of the river between Fort Montgomery and West Point, specifically to search for sites associated with the American Revolution. We have yet to definitively identify any of the watercraft lost during the Revolution. It's possible that based on sedimentation patterns in this portion of the river, that the remains of, for example, those burned ship hulls, they might be buried under sediment. And some of the things that we characterize as lumps and bumps in the sonar data might actually represent those buried shipwreck sites. So it remains to be done to test some of those lumps and bumps with some sort of excavation. We did, however, make a positive identification on many pieces of that chevaux de frise, that those giant caissons with the spiky things sunk by the Americans north of West Point with the goal of ensnaring British ships. Here's a side scan pass through the area. And again, thanks to having those firsthand accounts, there were letters between Americans talking about where these giant structures were sunk. They're essentially like giant Lincoln log construction, about 6 feet tall, put on the river when the river was iced over in the winter, filled with rocks, and then they would sink, or they did sink during the spring when the ice thawed. So we had a general idea of where they were. And sure enough, you can see some things that don't look quite natural in the side scan. And when we looked at it, you can almost see the texture of those rocks on the bottom in the multi-beam data. We also had the chance to work with some divers from the military academy at West Point. They were really excited because they love the history, and it's also really good dive training for like folks on their fire department who might be deployed to emergencies in the river. So they were anxious to join us. And we had them ground truth, like put eyes to the best of your ability in the Hudson River on the sites to, check to make sure that the things that we see in the sonar record are indeed objects on the river bottom. And this is actually not too far from Bannerman's Island, if you're familiar with the river. And even though they weren't archaeologically trained and they got a very brief crash course in how to map things by feel, the West Point divers came back with this site map, which was fantastic. So these timbers that they mapped on the bottom are the remains of those defensive obstructions that the Americans placed meant to ensnare British ships. And their survival in the river suggests that other sites from the war are probably still preserved there, just awaiting discovery. And incidentally, as a side note, the British had enough folks in the area who were watching what the Americans were doing, placing these giant caissons on the ice in the winter, that they knew they were there and they sailed right by them. So great idea, kind of not great execution. So I would be remiss if I didn't close with the fun fact that not all shipwrecks are found underwater. And in doing so, I get to share some really great news. On July 13th, 2010, mechanical excavators working adjacent to the south side of the 1967 World Trade Center foundations in Lower Manhattan uncovered the hull remains of a vessel buried 20 to 30 feet below street grade. Archaeologists monitoring the construction work saw uncovered timbers and stopped work at the site to assess the discovery. Following an initial assessment, the New York State Historic Preservation Office determined that the find was significant and directed archaeologists to form an appropriate team and excavate the site in a rapid but controlled manner. The excavation yielded the partial remains of an almost completely iron-fastened ship, with the preserved part measuring roughly 30 feet long by 15 feet wide. There were also thousands of small artifacts, some of which were directly associated with the ship, and the rest related to landfilling after the ship was abandoned. So if you're wondering, why is this ship on land? Well, this is not the first time that ships have been found to form material to support landfilling. In fact, it's not even the first one in Lower Manhattan. That goes to the Water Street ship that was uncovered in the 1970s. But you can see by this map where landfilling has occurred. And yeah, one great way to do that is throw your garbage and abandoned vessels to build up land. And we think that's what was going on here. After in-place or in situ documentation that included three-dimensional laser scanning, the hull structure was disassembled and the component parts wrapped and first shipped to the Maryland Archaeology Conservation Laboratory for wet storage, further documentation and assessment. In 2011, the timbers from the 2010 excavation were transferred to the Texas A&M, their TAMU's Conservation Research Laboratory for long-term wet storage, which gave the site owners, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, time to decide the best way to handle the find. The collection of timbers that was first exposed, that represents the after or rear half of the hull structure, and more was added in August 2011 when a brief excavation uncovered a small section of the remaining bow on the opposite side of the 10-foot tall retaining wall that had split the structure in two. So oops, but still not all is lost. Tree ring dating indicated that the white oak sampled was felled around 1773, and comparison with timbers from Independence Hall pointed to the origin of the Philadelphia area. It's not yet crystal clear, but so far, research suggests that the World Trade Center ship may have seen action during the American Revolution. After determining the best place to exhibit the find would be right here at the New York State Museum, the Lower Manhattan Development Corp moved forward with the project in January 2015. The disarticulated ship parts have been in long-term conservation at Texas A&M for several years, first stabilized with a solution of polyethylene glycol. What this does is it bulks up the structure of the wood, because wood, as it breaks down, organic parts decay and you're left with rigid cell walls. But if you remove it from the environment in which it's been sitting for hundreds of years, it will decay rapidly. So polyethylene glycol, or PEG, will go into those cells and pump it up. And then after that, a round of controlled freeze drying. So finally, at long last, the timbers are going to be unpacked from the freeze dryer this coming Monday. And soon after that, will be packed into shipping containers and brought here. The ship will be reassembled over several weeks this spring in South Hall, just yonder by the Cohoes Mastodon. So please stay tuned for the arrival and reconstruction of the World Trade Center ship. Thank you. So I hope that gave you a little insight into some of the amazing sites that we have here associated with the nautical and maritime history of the American Revolution in New York.